think so. We'll be all right. We'll try and see. All right.
Bible. The story is set over 100 years after the Babylonian exile of the Israelites from their land. And while some Jews did return to Jerusalem, remember Ezra and Nehemiah, many did not. And so the book of Esther is about a Jewish community living in Susa, the capital city of the ancient Persian Empire. The main characters in this story are two Jews, Mordecai and then his niece Esther. And then there's the king of Persia, who's something of a drunken pushover in this story. And then there's the Persian official Haman, the cunning villain. Now this is a curious book in the Bible, mainly for the fact that God is never even mentioned, not once. Which might strike you as kind of odd. I mean, isn't the Bible about God? But this is a brilliant technique by the author, who's anonymous, by the way. It's an invitation to read this story looking for God's activity, and there are signs of it everywhere. The story is full of very odd, quote, coincidences and ironic reversals, and it all forces you to see God's purpose at work, but behind the scenes. Let's just dive into the story. The book opens with the king of Persia throwing two elaborate banquet feasts that last a total of 187 days, and it's all for the grandiose purpose of displaying his greatness and splendor. On the last day of the banquet feast, he's really drunk, and he demands that his wife, Queen Vashti, appear at the party to show off her beauty. She refuses, and so in a drunken rage, the king deposes Vashti and makes the silly decree that all Persian men should now be the masters of their own homes. Then he holds a beauty pageant because he wants to find a new queen. This is like a really bad soap opera. But it's right here that we're introduced to Esther and Mordecai. Esther hides her Jewish identity and enters the beauty pageant and wins. And the king is so obsessed with Esther that he elevates her to become the new queen of Persia. Now after this, and even more serendipitous, is the fact that Mordecai just happens to overhear two royal guards plotting to murder the king. And so he informs Esther, who in turn informs the king, and Mordecai gets credit for saving the king's life. Now right here from the beginning, God's not mentioned anywhere, but this all seems providentially ordered. What is it that God's up to? You have to keep reading. We're next introduced to Haman, who's not actually a Persian. He's called an Agagite. He's a descendant of the ancient Canaanites. Remember 1 Samuel chapter 15. The king elevates Haman to the highest position in the kingdom, and he demands that everybody kneel before Haman. Well, when Mordecai sees Haman, he refuses to kneel, which of course fills Haman with rage. And when he finds out that Mordecai's Jewish, Haman successfully persuades the king to enact this crazy decree to destroy all of the Jewish people. And to decide the date of the Jews' annihilation, Haman rolls the dice. A die is called pur in Hebrew. Tuck that away for later. 11 months later, on the 13th of Adar, all the Jews will die. Haman and the king then have a drinking banquet to celebrate their really horrible decision. So the focus now turns to Mordecai and Esther, who are the only hope for the Jewish people. They make a plan that Esther is going to reveal her Jewish identity to the king and ask him to reverse the decree. But approaching the king without a royal request is, according to Persian law, an act worthy of death. So in a key statement, Mordecai is confident that even if Esther remains silent, that deliverance for the Jews will arrive from another place. And then Mordecai wonders aloud. He says, who knows? Maybe you've become queen for this very moment. Esther responds with bravery, and she purposes to go to the king with her amazing words, if I perish, I perish. Now in what unfolds, we watch the ironic reversal of all of Haman's evil plans. So Esther hosts the king and Haman at a first banquet, and she says that she wants to make a special request of both of them at an exclusive banquet the following day. So Haman leaves the banquet totally drunk, and he sees Mordecai in the street. He fumes with anger, and he orders that a tall stake be built so that Mordecai can be impaled upon it in the morning. It seems like things can't get any worse for the Jews and for Mordecai. But all of a sudden, the story pivots. It just so happens that night The king, he can't sleep. And he has the royal chronicles read to him for good bedtime reading. And he just happens to hear about how Mordecai had saved the king's life. He had totally forgotten. So in the morning, Haman enters to request Mordecai's execution. And the king, in that moment, orders Haman to honor Mordecai publicly for saving his life. So now Haman has to lead Mordecai around the city on a royal horse, telling everyone to praise him. Now this moment in the story, it's a pivot for the whole book. It begins Haman's downfall and Mordecai's rise to power. Watch how this works. The day after is Esther's second banquet. So the king and Haman arrive, and Esther informs the king that first of all she's Jewish, and second that Haman has enacted a decree to murder her, and to murder Mordecai, who saved his life, and to murder all of the Jews. Now the king's had a lot to drink, so when he hears this news, he goes into yet one more drunken rage. And he orders that Haman be impaled on the very stake he made for Mordecai. It's ironic and a grisly way for Haman to go. Haman's execution, however, doesn't solve the problem of the decree to kill all of the Jews. So the focus now turns to Esther and Mordecai as they make a plan to reverse the decree. They discover that the king can't revoke a decree that he's already made. So instead, the king commissions Mordecai to issue a counter-decree. On the appointed day that all of the Jews were supposed to be killed, the 13th of Adar, now the Jews are ordered to defend themselves and to destroy any who plotted to kill them. Then Mordecai, Esther, and Jews everywhere hold banquets and feasts to celebrate this new decree, and Mordecai is elevated to a seat beside the king. Eventually, the decreed day comes, and the Jews triumph over their enemies. First, they destroy Haman's family, and then any other Persian officials who had joined in Haman's plot. And then on a second day, they get permission to destroy any who plotted against them throughout the entire kingdom. This results in joy and celebration as the Jews are rescued from annihilation. The story then tells about how Esther and Mordecai established by decree this annual 2-day feast of Purim to commemorate their deliverance from destruction. And the name of the feast comes from Haman's dice. Remember? Purim. The book concludes with a short epilogue as Mordecai is elevated to second in command in the kingdom, and we are told now of his royal greatness and splendor as the Jews thrive in exile. Now, step back. Notice how this whole story has been designed. The story was full of moments of ironic reversal, but we can now see the whole story is structured as an ironic reversal, right down to the details. So the king's splendor and feasts and decrees are mirrored by Mordecai's splendor and feasts and decrees at the end. Esther and Mordecai, they first save the king, but now in the end they save all of the Jews. Then you have Haman's elevation and edicts and banquet that gets reversed by Mordecai's elevation and edict and banquet. And then at the center, you have Esther and Mordecai's planning scenes, and then Esther's 2 banquets that act as a frame around the greatest moment of reversal in the whole story. Haman's humiliation and Mordecai's exaltation. Beautiful. Another fascinating feature of this book is the moral ambiguity of the characters. There's a lot of drinking and anger and sex and murder, of which Mordecai and Esther are a part. Not to mention their violation of many commands in the Torah, like marrying Gentiles or eating impure foods. And so the story is not putting Mordecai and Esther forward as moral examples, as if it endorses all of their behavior. But they are put forward as models of trust and hope when things get really bad. And so the book of Esther comes back to that question with which we begin: why God is not mentioned. The message of this book seems to be that when God seems absent, when his people are in exile, when they're unfaithful to the Torah, does this mean that God is done with Israel? Has God abandoned his promises? And the book of Esther says no. It invites us to see that God can and does work in the real mess and moral ambiguity of human history. And he uses the faithfulness of even morally compromised people to accomplish his purposes. And so the book of Esther asks us to be willing to trust God's providence even when we can't see it working, and to hope that no matter how bad things get, God is committed to redeeming his world. And that's what the book of Esther is all about.
Can you hear me all right? That's good? Okay. All right, be turning to the book of Psalms 4, verse 2. All right, John, read that out loud.
Psalms 4, verse 2.
Yes.
All you sons of men, how long will you turn my glory into shame? How long will you love vanity and seek after leasing?
Try 2 and 4.
Psalm 2, verse 4. He that sitteth in the heaven shall laugh, the Lord shall have them in derision.
All right,
That ain't it either.
that's it. No matter what man does or what man plans, who ultimately is in charge? God is. And he's sitting in heaven laughing, pushing to the side what man decides to do. So keep that in mind as we are studying. Wayne, if you would. We have an update on Neil. Neil is now in room 5319, but is planning to go to Encompass. Donna is planning to go to Encompass. And the reason that Julie said was that they were better equipped for brain injuries. Little Collins had a good day. They removed the splint from his mouth. The doctors were pleased, and I think they stopped and ate on the way home. He was allowed real food, and I think he got mac and cheese, which is not food, but kids think it is. And we are glad to have Robert B. with us. Robert's got a good report and almost doing a backflip. Or is that falling over? And so keep that in mind. And I want to thank, have you done something different you were here, Mike?
He's losing it. I'm letting it go out.
Have you always split it? That's the way mine is right now. I'm going for a ponytail. But Mike did an excellent job last week. Huh? Oh, I did. I can tell when people do a good job, and you did a good job. And I'm going to be out of town about once a month. No, we got some good ones that fill in, but I just want you to know, Mike, I really do appreciate. All right, when you think about the story of Esther, and this was post-exile. They were, you have the Babylonians who had kept them in captivity, and now the Persians. And the Persians owned just about every bit of land that you could see. And I never have understood the idea that God is never mentioned. God is from chapter 1 to the last chapter, and what he has done and how he works behind the clouds. I mean, everything about it has God's name written all over it. And because the name of God is not in it, there are some that have rejected the book of Esther. Esther is one of the earlier books. It was always accepted as a part of the canon or part of the text. And then you've got, folks that come along and say because God's name's not in it, it obviously is not scripture. You could just go through and And knowing the story, you can see God working and moving and stopping. I mean, here was a king, Artaxerxes, or by the Greeks he was called Ahasuerus, who was deceived. And they're right. I mean, you talk about, Humpty Dumpty fell off the wall, and that's what Mordecai and Esther were. They were broken people. And one of the beautiful things about this is that no matter who you are, if God has a purpose, He's going to use you, whether you're broken or not. Who do you think about in the New Testament that were, if you and I were writing the book, we just write them out of the book. Who would they be? Ananias, Sapphira? Judas? Simon the sorcerer? What good godly people? Paul? I mean, you stop. Could you, and I've challenged you with this before. All right, you go back there, and Wayne has always been married to Helen, and all of a sudden, Wayne comes up missing, and we find out that he was stoned to death under the authority of Saul. And Saul, now Paul, comes and preaches here, and as he's looking out, he sees Helen, and he's wondering, I wonder if I made her a widow. And then you have to listen to this man who stoned your husband to death. I guarantee you, if that was the case, if the elders let Paul get up to preach, I guarantee you, you'd leave. I ain't going to listen to that murderer. Or Christ who looked Peter in the eyes and said, Peter, I'm praying for you. I'm praying that Satan doesn't get a hold of you. And then, of course, Peter, he backs up and he said, Lord, I'll go to prison for you. I'll die for you. And he turns around and he's not even there. But he did say, when you are converted, feed my sheep. As broken as Peter was, God said, one day you're going to be converted. You're going to make the change. You're going to mature. And you're going to be a shepherd of the sheep. And you've got that here with Daniel. What was Daniel's stance when the king said to him, when Darius said to him, here, you eat the best of my meat and my provisions? What did Daniel say? No. He was not going to corrupt himself with the Gentiles. And here you've got, and as you read the story, and as we look at the story, they didn't even know that Esther was a Hebrew. It wasn't till later on, and Esther went back in to Ahasuerus, Artaxerxes, and said, I'm a Hebrew. These are my people. And then you got Mordecai out there who's kind of like God watching over. He wants to hear reports. He wants to see what's going on. Do you believe in spying on people?
Depends on who they are.
All right, depends on who they are. But typically, do Christians spy on each other?
No.
We do if you got Facebook. And you get on there and man, you can find out when they were born, how many toes they've got. And this is almost Mordecai. Mordecai goes by every day to see what's going on. If he can hear the news of what's going on. But as you back out on a picture, and I know that as he was taught, when you were watching that video, what went against what you've been taught? Yeah, and day by day he's building it, and you hear the hammers, and they're building this gallows for him to be hung on. Is that really important? And sometimes what we do is we major on minors. Thing is, he died. Haman died at his own plan. They made a plan, a decree that could not be rescinded. And once Artaxerxes learnt the truth of who Mordecai was, he humiliated Haman. But here's the thing about our egos. Who bowed down to Haman? The law said everybody did. Except what? Mordecai. And so as you're going through the street and everyone's bowing down, there's Mordecai stiff-backed, and he wasn't. And it so infuriated Haman that one man didn't bow down. Brethren, that's what ego will do to you.
How did they get that guy up there on that skip through?
No, they took a helicopter and flew over and let him go. I don't know. I don't know how they skewered you like that. But that's not really the story. The story was Haman had a plan, and that plan was reversed, and it took his life. All right, another question that I have is, how old was Esther in the story? And we'll read our reading. How old was Esther? What are some of the words in chapter 2? And I realize you didn't have the questions and everything before. All right, the Bible says that all of the staples, the man in charge, went out and found young virgins. 16. It goes anywhere from 15 to 80. Some say 75 because that is the numerical value of the letters in her name. Wouldn't you love to be the preacher and sit out and say, well, 80 years old, oh yeah, you're all too ugly. What describes her? And Mordecai had taken to raise her. You think that is God's providence, or that's just an accident? I mean, Mordecai looked at her and said, if you don't do it, someone else will. Mordecai knew God's plan. And he said, you were born for a moment just like this. But he also says, if you don't do it, someone else will. But God's law, God's will is going to be done in this. And so she is described, number one, as a woman who was beautiful, and that's in figure. You know, she was the hourglass, but she was also very soft on your eyes. She was beautiful to look at. And so let's look at this. How do I?
So was Sarah.
Yeah, so was Sarah. Right, so let's look at this just a minute. And this is some things that I was found. And this is about a Jewish historian or a Greek historian talking about Ahasuerus. And it says that Ahasuerus was born in 518 BC. Just some facts here. He became the king of Persia, at the age of 33. He got rid of Vashti the wife that would not come in and please the men at a victory battle. He was 36 when that happened. He went to war against Greece when he was 39 to 49. He married Esther when he was 40. He killed Haman at the age of 45. He was assassinated at the age of 53. And so there was a little bit of difference in their age. But so many of them think that when Haman's plot was planned, that Esther was somewhere in the neighborhood of around 20 years of age. So let's turn to chapter 2 of the book of Esther. And as you look at it, just watch how God is working. You know, great plans. And then God just kind of laughs at it with the idea that's not the way that it's going to be. You can plan all you want. And there you see God's hand working in it. And so as you have the story, Vashti's put away, all the young virgins are brought in, the ones that pleased Ahasuerus. You couldn't be overweight. They were put on a food diet over a period of a year, both with the food, the cleansing of the body, and through spices. 6 months of one, 6 months of the other. And then you went before the king, and if you pleased him, he put you in his second harem house. And so you have this story of a Hebrew, and you've got to understand, you got a Hebrew that became the queen of Persia.
You have to understand the Egyptians did the same thing. And the reason they did that was because the common people ate a lot of garlic, and therefore they smelled, when they would sweat, they smelled like garlic and very pungent odors. It was a purification so they would smell better.
All right? Did you get that? In this country, United States of America, back in, what was it, pre-Civil War, they basically took a bath once a year. The saying, don't throw out the baby with the bath water. Who went first? Yeah, Tarzan. And then Jane. And then the kids. What would the water look like? And so a lot of our sayings come from our history. And so you have God putting a Hebrew girl as the queen of the Persians. And really, the greatest story about that was that Esther was willing to risk her life for her people. And God put her there. Well, let's begin reading in chapter 2, verse 1. And after these things, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had abated, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. And then the king's young men. Now, in chapter 1, you have the king's wise men. Now what you've got is a bunch of foolish men advising a drunk king what he should do. And then the king's young men who attended him said, let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king. Now, is this how a Hebrew or a Jew would live? Or is this how the world would live? Let me also there were advantages and disadvantages about being in the king's harem. Number one, you had the very best of everything. Vashti, even though she was the queen, had almost no intimacy whatsoever with her king, the husband. And so it's not a matter of that she was in his chamber every night. And so she didn't have an intimate relationship with her husband, the king. She had no other intimate relations with anyone except those within the harem. And so it sounds like it's a good thing. But there are also some terrible disadvantages to that sort of a relationship. And so go find the most beautiful young virgins to be sought out for the king, and let the king appoint officers and all the providences of his kingdom to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem of Susa, the capital under custody of Higi, the king's eunuch. What's this king eunuch's thing? Isn't that an adult class? If you were the king and you had your property, these young virgin women, who would you want taking care of them? Someone that had no sexual drive. And this was very common. Candices. You remember that story. All right, and so they were under the care of the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the women. Let the cosmetics be given to them, and let the young women who pleased the king be queen instead of Vashti. And he was sorry. He was sorry that in a drunken state he would do that to his wife. You see the agony there. And so let the cosmetics be given to them, and let the young women who pleased the king be queen instead of Vashti. And this pleased the king, and he did so. Now there was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jairus, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. Kish was the father of who? Who? Yeah. Now, when you're looking at this small picture, and we're just looking at this reading and the book of Esther, and there was, and it was not a Jewish festival, Purim, but Purim was a festive, it was a very secular, it was a very joyous holiday. And because that's not mentioned in other books, they also want to reject the book of Esther. But this festival of Purim celebrated the centuries of life. And he goes on, and we'll look at it in the latter part of this. It celebrates the life of Jews for centuries. All right. What would have happened if you back away from this and you see, let's just say that Ahasuerus was able to kill every Jew, man, woman, and child. Where does history go? The promise to Abraham would be broken. There would be no church. There would be no brethren. In God putting Esther in there, you see that that was a link that saved God's promise. If they would have killed, there would have been no Christ born. There would have been no promise. And so we can look at it and we get bogged down sometimes and we just forget to back off and look, why is this book here? What's the story of the book? Who have been carried away, verse 6, from Jerusalem among the captivities carried away by Jehoiakim, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. Some of the Jews went back to Jerusalem. Some of them were carried away into the Babylonian and Persian captivity. He was bringing up Hadassah. Who is this Hadassah? Who is Esther? And so you've got a Hebrew name and you've also got a Greek name. And again, here was a woman who could be in the harem and no one knew that she was a Hebrew. She ate their food. She acted just like them. Whereas everyone knew who Daniel was. All right, this week, read chapter 2. Look at your questions. Things that just slap you. I mean, write it down and ask the questions, and we'll do our best to see if we can't answer it. A question that I have is if you and I were someone like Esther that was chosen for an hour like this, would we do it? Or would someone else have to do it because we backed out? And brethren, I tell you now, if you're unaware of the world that we live in, you can put a statement on social media and 10 years from now, it can come back and haunt you and you can lose your job. Simply because you took a stand that is culturally incorrect. And I tell you, the one that's absolutely destroying this country is we can't even figure out what a woman is. And now, what's your pronoun? Have you seen those interviews? They'll walk up to someone and say, what's your pronoun? And why? And there was one there today where a girl was they were talking about abortion. And she said, well, what do you think about the genocide in this country? She said, there is no genocide. That's offensive to say that. And the interviewing lady said, what about abortion? She said, 886,000 children are destroyed every year, but they're not a child, they're a fetus. All right, explain that a little bit better. They're not a viable child until the umbilical cord is cut and that child is free from the mother. Then it becomes a human life. And so it's not genocide, it's not murder. And we're talking about college kids. All right, study the book of Esther. Read it, not that long. Mike will have it read. And he's going to teach. Mike, let me tell you, Bob Beeler told me that you were a good teacher. Did you not, Mike? I mean, Bob? And when I heard you last week, I agreed with him. And I'm not just saying that, I absolutely mean it. Thank you.